everybody. Good afternoon almost. Happy Pride Month. My name is Zoe Thompson. Yeah, woo! My name is Zoe Thompson, and I am the social strategy leader for KPMG's US ESG practice. Now, hopefully everybody knows by now ESG, environmental, social, governance. And social, as Francine talked about yesterday so well, is the relationship between organizations and people. So that could be customers, that can be employees, future employees, current employees, society as a whole, the communities where companies operate. Social definitely includes CSR, for sure, but also includes diversity and inclusion, workplace experience, environmental justice, equitable housing, health equity, equitable and ethical supply chain, and human rights. So last month, US Secretary of State Andrew Blinken said that in the fight to preserve human dignity and to fight for human rights, NGOs and academia need to partner with the for-profit world to fight the good fight. And that's why we're here. So switching gears a little bit, but we believe that to really make an impact, you gotta find allies where you can. And I am thrilled to be here today with two of my colleagues from KPMG. So Jessica Libby, who is a trade and compliance expert, and Jose Trevino, who is an expert in ethics and forensic accounting, to talk about what the other allies are bringing to the table and really see how we can find support in perhaps some unexpected areas. So Jessica, let's start with you. What is the legislation? Has anything happened recently in terms of the law that makes this a more timely topic?
You know, Zoe, the fact that we're having this conversation here on this stage today really is a pivotal moment in this discussion. We have had laws on the books around importing product made with forced labor for almost a century. But unfortunately, that same law had a loophole that allowed for products to come in made with forced labor if we couldn't make them in adequate quantities here in the US.
Okay, hold on. Can we just pause for a second? So what I hear you saying is that it's always been illegal to sell products that were made with forced labor or modern slavery, but the loophole enabled it to happen.
That's right.
And so that has changed. We've closed the loophole, and so we're finding ways to eradicate, starting from the law, how we sell goods in the US.
That's right. So in the last 2 years, we had a really important piece of legislation passed here in the US. It's called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And effectively what that law states is that if you are importing product or components of that product from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, it is presumed to be made with forced labor. Now, let me break that down just a little bit. Think about if you have leather shoes with cotton shoestrings. Those cotton shoestrings may be at risk because cotton is a known commodity that is coming out of the Xinjiang region. So those products, the shoe in its totality, could be subject to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So again, really important milestone moment here in the US that has put the burden on importers to demonstrate that their supply chains are clean of forced labor, that they have conducted due diligence, and that they are confident that they are not sourcing products made with forced labor. And something I'm really proud of is that the US is leading this. There are other countries around the world that are also following fast behind the US and looking at other pieces of legislation, but the US is a leader here.
Yeah, that's exciting. Jose, anything you want to add from the legislative perspective?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, buenas tardes, for those Spanish speakers in the room. And I'm going to break I am very privileged, I feel very privileged to be in this stage with two of very passionate professionals. So, as Jessica indicated, respect for human rights has been a priority for businesses for many, many years. There is, however, a heightened awareness and sensitivity at the importance and the role that companies play in protecting human rights, not only within their operations, but extended to the supply chains. And as Jessica indicated, forced labor has been the focus of regulatory interest, and I would argue societal interest because of a number of situations. I'll share a couple of interesting statistics. In 2021, the International Labor Organization calculated that almost 28 million people in the world are forced to work against their will. And out of that, 3 million people are forced by their own governments. So clearly, forced labor is a situation that continues to be prevalent, continues to affect many countries, many companies in the world.
Wait, hold on. You said many countries in the world. This doesn't actually happen in the United States, does it?
Well, as a matter of fact, it does. It does. So just in the pandemic, in 2022, there were 130,000 unaccompanied minors that were placed by Health and Human Services with so-called sponsors in the US. And in the positive outcomes, those sponsors were family members, were relatives. And in the not so positive outcomes, those sponsors were human traffickers. So clearly, forced labor, which is one of the most egregious violations of human rights, is a situation that, yes, it happens in certain geographies that are more prone to that behavior, but it happens also in the US, especially in states that received a lot of immigration. And there's another consideration that we should be mindful, and that is human rights risks, especially those related to labor, are heightened in difficult times, in times of crisis. Jobs become more scarce, people get more desperate, companies look to decrease their costs, human trafficking rears its horrible head, and all of that generates a so-called perfect storm where there's a tremendous amount of abuse. And vulnerable populations, such as children, are significantly affected. So we need to be very mindful, and at KPMG, we take every opportunity we have to share with clients the importance of taking a proactive stance, not waiting for those situations to surface to address them on a timely basis.
So vulnerable people, challenging times, it's a recipe for disaster, not just in the US, but abroad as well. So we've talked about, we understand it's obviously, it's a humanitarian issue. It's also a business issue. So who are some of these new allies? Who are some of these new stakeholders that have skills, that have abilities that can really help fight the fight? Jessica, actually, Jose, let's start with you.
It's actually a very good, very interesting question, because historically in the field of human rights, you had social activists, you had human rights attorneys, and you're starting to see new players, new professions coming on board. You have marketing folks helping good companies sell their products. You're having former whistleblowers working with compliance departments internally in organizations to create better mechanisms, better grievance mechanisms, so that when someone who is affected by a situation and is courageous enough to raise their hand, that experience is more compassionate. You have computer scientists designing apps so that you can go to the supermarket and scan a product, and it'll tell you whether that product is tainted with forced labor. So you have all these different professions, different specialties within organizations. And I think, or rather convinced, that our experience at KPMG, our story, is one I'm particularly proud of. Less than a year ago, thanks to the guidance and leadership of our fearless leader, Zoe Thompson, the firm recognized that there were a number of very passionate professionals. You had some folks in audit, you had some folks in tax, you had some folks in advisory, such as myself, who were working isolated in helping clients deal with their human rights challenges. So the firm decided to put all of us under the same roof, so to speak, and that allowed us to form a tremendously powerful brain trust, where we take those multiple disciplines. It wasn't easy, by the way. You have folks from different backgrounds, different countries, different languages, different professions, but bringing those all together and as allies that we are, forming together a really strong team. So I'm very proud of that.
So the definition of an activist has just expanded. It can include computer science. It can include finance. It can include marketers. Who else? Who else do you see participating in this crusade, Jessica?
Yeah, so I think, again, keeping in mind that the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and other similar legislation is still relatively new, we're still identifying who some of these allies are. Shameless plug here, we conducted an anti-forced labor survey, and we have some sneak previews of the results. It'll be available later this summer, but that survey indicated to us that the programs that are being managed by companies as it relates to anti-forced labor and human rights, less than 10% of them actually leverage the ESG team. So all of you in this room, like incredible professionals that have great backgrounds in process and data and systems that could be redeployed to support these efforts. I'm going to talk about two specific examples that we have seen be successful in as we talk about allies within organizations. The first is make friends with your supply chain, logistics, transportation folks. These individuals have a wealth of experience in understanding how to read things like commercial invoices or bill of ladings. And this is really important because, go ahead.
This is just interesting because you're talking about, I mean, a bill of an invoice does not sound like a tool that you would use to fight human trafficking. But what I hear you saying is that there are tools, there are red flags that you can see, and that we've got people and organizations who have the history of looking at that data, at looking at that information, and we can enlist them in a new way. Is that a fair way to characterize this?
That's exactly right. So it's not reinventing the wheel. It's using access to data that companies already have. Companies have access to their import data through U.S. Customs, through their customs broker. They have access to commercial invoices. And commercial invoices, this is where my trade geek comes out, has a wealth of information, right? It has factory level information, manufacturer, zip codes that may indicate where that product is being sourced, a very important element to this discussion.
So your procurement folks are really your detectives, and they can help you solve these mysteries.
That's right, and I'll offer one more ally to go out and make friends with, and that is your finance team. So your finance team is helping with supplier onboarding, they're doing supplier vetting, they have access to supplier level information around address information, and they're already running due diligence around whether those suppliers are on any particular list as it relates to US government regulations. This is another element that they can run against to ensure that, again, you're not engaging suppliers within your supply chain that potentially are at risk for forced labor.
Thank you. That's really, if there's one thing we want to leave you all with is that we think about the capes. We think about the superheroes. Sometimes the cape is actually a suit and tie, and that's okay. We have to enlist help wherever we can to really fight the good fight. So, talking about enlisting allies, what would you suggest? How do we actually do that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Zoe. So when I think about how we best engage allies, we talked about, we have a 3-step process. Identify, engage, and invite. We already talked about the identification, right? There's a lot of folks within your organization that can support you from a data document perspective. The engage part is so important. It might be the most important step of all. It's meeting people with where they are at, right? So a lot of your allies in this discussion, they may not have a human rights background. So when you're talking about UN guiding principles on business and human rights, some professionals may say, great, that's wonderful, I know exactly what that means. And others may say, UN what? So help them to understand exactly the context and how you need them to engage in this discussion. And the third piece is really inviting them to the table. So again, you've identified them, you've brought them up to speed, you've provided context for them. Now help them to see that they are part of the solution. Make them feel valued as a part of that conversation. Again, the intent behind the regulations that we're seeing is to really elevate the global manufacturing community to higher standards as it relates to supply chain responsibility. That's what we're here for.
Jose, anything to add?
Well, Jessica has spoken about the success stories. I spend a lot of my time putting out fires and helping companies when situations have already surfaced. And that has taught me many a valuable lesson, but I think one of the most useful ones is, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the benefits of taking a proactive stance. And I'll give you an example. One of the steps in, and as Jessica mentioned, the establishment of a human rights program within an organization involves a journey. So as with any journey, it involves a number of steps. A critical one is conducting a risk assessment or a due diligence exercise where every single element of the organization and all of its operations are assessed as to the impacts that they are causing to various numbers of stakeholders. And the extension of that risk assessment or that exercise to involve suppliers, to involve them as allies, as Jessica pointed out. So conducting that exercise, and one of the reasons, and Jessica also mentioned it, it's amazing to me how most of these things are common sense. No, you're not talking about large re-engineering, very sophisticated, very expensive endeavors. They become very expensive when trouble reaches your shore. No, companies don't want to make, and I heard an attorney say once, when you get a government subpoena or a subpoena from a regulator, it's not the best time to make decisions. So that's why.
That's probably good advice in general.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. There are times to make decisions, times not, and that would not be a good
But it is particularly relevant in the arena of human rights. Again, there is a lot of information that can be gleaned, bringing in your allies to precisely identify what are those weak spots where you don't have any controls, where you don't have any measures. And I'll give another example. One of the best practices that companies should implement is a whistleblower system or a grievance mechanism, not only to allow their workforce to raise their hands when they're observing a situation, but extending those mechanisms outside so that suppliers, customers, and all of the stakeholders with which a company interacts can also bring forth and heighten situations as they are surfacing and not necessarily when they've been occurring, X amount of time. Just to share with you, a fraud, for instance, can take 18 months in a company to be detected. So a situation involving a human rights violation can also take that long. And the earlier the company identifies it and addresses it and remediates, the impact is going to be that much less.
Absolutely. So one of the things, and we hear this with ESG, and all of you have heard the term greenwashing, or when it's talking more about social performative action. And that's not what we want. And we've talked the last day and a half about impact. What are we really doing to make an impact, not just to have activity? Given that, have you seen any success stories? So have there been any companies that have actually done this well and do this right?
Yeah, it's a great question, Zoe. So our most recent survey indicated that as relates to anti-forced labor program development, only 10% of the companies believe that their program is at a level of maturity of execution. So it's certainly a journey that a lot of companies are on. Where we have seen success is around companies that we've worked with to engage early, conduct a risk assessment, look at due diligence. We've identified red flags that are aligned with the International Labor Organization red flags. Based on that, we've worked with the supplier. In this particular situation, the supplier indicated that they had some policy development that was left to be occurred. Mm-hmm. We worked with that supplier to update the policy. So in other words, we remediated the activity. We did not remove the supplier, we remediated, which is really the goal of these efforts.
That's an interesting, so it's really talking about working with suppliers, identifying the problems, and potentially even rehabilitating them.
That's right.
Okay. We are actually at time. So thank you all so much. If you want to continue this conversation, a QR code should be, it's not. Okay, there it is, hey. So there's our QR code. Love to talk to some of you on the break. But if there's, again, one thing we leave you with, it's there are a lot of allies in this fight. And we are all striving to embrace humanity and to preserve human rights and human dignity, both in the US and abroad. And you may have some unexpected, unsung heroes who can help you in that fight. So thank you. We're KPMG. Really great to be with you today.